Imagine standing at a funeral, tears streaming down the faces of mourners, except for one person. She stands there, laughing, softly at first, then uncontrollably. Everyone whispers, unsettled. Is she cursed? Possessed? Or does she know something they don't? But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. What if laughter wasn't just a reaction, but a warning? Imagine waking up to find your entire village vanished. No footprints. No signs of struggle. Just empty huts and a chilling silence. Who or what could erase an entire community overnight? The village gathered in mourning, their voices rising in sorrowful wails as Chief Tobo's body was lowered into the earth. Women dressed in black suede, their hands pressed to their faces, tears streaming down their cheeks. The men stood rigid, their heads bowed in solemn respect. Smoke from burning incense curled into the air, mixing with the scent of freshly turned soil. Zanele stood at the back of the crowd, her arms wrapped around herself. The weight of grief pressed down on the village like a thick fog. But then, a sound cut through the mourning like a blade. Laughter. Sharp. Unexpectedly. Wrong. Head snapped toward her. Eyes widened in shock. The wailing ceased, replaced by stunned silence. Did she just? At the chief's funeral. The murmur spread quickly, turning into whispers of outrage. Elder Nkosi's face darkened as he took a step forward, his gaze burning with fury. Zanele's own hands flew to her mouth, as if she could shove the laughter back in. But before she could explain, she heard it. I was no saint, Zanele. Tell them the truth, if you dare. The voice curled around her ears, low and rasping, filled with something that sent a chill down her spine. It came from nowhere, and everywhere. It was the chief's voice. But Chief Tobo was dead. Zanele staggered back, her breath catching in her throat. The world around her blurred, the accusing faces of the villagers melting into shadow. Zanele. Elder Nkosi's voice snapped through the air. His grip was firm as he grabbed her by the arm, his fingers pressing hard into her skin. What have you done? If you're still watching, comment I hear him too, below. They dragged her to the village square, where a restless crowd had gathered. Some looked at her in horror, others in disgust. Even her own mother kept her eyes on the ground. You have brought shame upon this village, Elder Nkosi said, his voice laced with fury. To laugh at a funeral, the funeral of our chief. The murmurs of agreement grew louder. Zanele's mouth felt dry. She wanted to speak, to explain, but the words caught in her throat. The voice still echoed in her ears, curling around her mind like smoke. They will never believe you. A whisper. A warning. Speak, girl. Elder Nkosi demanded. Zanele lifted her head. Her voice was quiet, but steady. Because she took a breath, knowing there was no turning back. The dead are not silent. The village held its breath. What do you think Zanele will reveal? Comment below. A heavy silence settled over the village square. Zanele's words hung in the air like an unspoken curse. The villagers stared at her, their faces frozen in a mixture of disbelief and unease. Elder Nkosi narrowed his eyes. What did you say? Zanele swallowed, her pulse hammering against her throat. She could still hear the voice, deep and rasping, curling around her thoughts like smoke. Tell them. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, Mama Jobu, the chief's widow, stepped forward. Her eyes were red from crying, her hands trembling as she pointed at Zanele. She is cursed. A woman who laughs at the dead cannot be trusted. A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. She should be exiled, someone whispered. Zanele's chest tightened. She could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. But deep inside, another feeling stirred, something dark, something angry. Why should she stay silent? Why should she carry this secret alone? She raised her chin. I laughed because I heard Chief Tobo's voice. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Elder Nkosi's face hardened. Do not speak such foolishness. Zanele shook her head. I heard him. Her voice grew stronger. And he told me the truth. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. What truth? A man called out. Zanele took a deep breath. Her heart pounded, but the words stumbled out before she could stop them. That Chief Tobo was no saint. The reaction was immediate. Women gasped, hands flying to their mouths. Men muttered angrily. Someone in the crowd spat on the ground. How dare you? Mama Jobu's voice trembled with rage. My husband was a great man. A leader. Elder Nkosi's expression darkened. You insult the dead, Zanele. You have until sundown to take back your words. Zanele clenched her fist. She could feel the villagers closing in around her, their anger growing like a fire. But the voice in her head spoke again, calm and steady. They won't believe you now, but they will soon. She took a shaky breath. I won't take it back. The crowd erupted in chaos. And then, she heard it again. A whisper. But this time, it wasn't just the chief's voice. There were many voices. Crying. Confessing. Screaming. Zanele gasped, her hands flying to her ears. The village square spun around her. The voices grew louder, overlapping, whispering names and sins. She wasn't just hearing Chief Tobo. She was hearing all of them. What do you think Zanele will do next? Zanele staggered back, pressing her hands to her ears. The voices were everywhere, whispering, pleading, screaming. They crawled into her skull like fingers, filling her mind with secrets she was never meant to hear. Forgive me. I didn't mean to. The well, they buried him in the well. Tell my wife I'm sorry. Tell her the child wasn't mine. Her knees buckled, and she gasped for breath. The villagers were still shouting, still accusing her of disrespecting the dead, but they couldn't hear what she heard. They had no idea the dead were speaking to her. Elder Nkosi took a step forward, his voice sharp. Enough of this madness. If you will not take back your words, then you must leave this village before sundown. The finality of his words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Some nodded in agreement. Others averted their eyes, as if ashamed to watch her downfall. Zanele looked around, panic rising in her chest. You don't understand. The dead. We honor the dead, Zanele. Elder Nkosi's voice was cold. We do not mock them. Mama Jobu spat at the ground near Zanele's feet. May their spirits haunt you for your lies. If only they knew. The voices were still there, growing louder, more frantic. The weight of them pressed against Zanele's skull, making it hard to think. Then, just as suddenly as they came, the voices stopped. Silence. Zanele's breath came in ragged gasps. She lifted her head slowly, and as she did, she saw something that made her blood turn cold. At the far end of the village square, standing just beyond the crowd, was Chief Tobo. Or at least, what was left of him. His body was still wrapped in the burial cloth, his face pale and sunken. His lips did not move, but his voice echoed in her mind. They buried more than just me, Zanele. Her breath hitched. They buried the truth. Zanele's hands trembled. She knew then the voices would not stop until she listened. She had a choice. Leave the village in shame or uncover the truth that had been buried with the dead. And she already knew what she had to do. She straightened her spine, turning to Elder Nkosi. If I prove to you that the chief was not the man you think he was, will you let me stay? Gasps rippled through the crowd. Elder Nkosi frowned. You think you can prove such a thing? Zanele nodded. Give me 3 days. The elder hesitated. Then, finally, he said, 3 days. But if you fail, you will leave this village forever. Zanele glanced back toward where Chief Tobo had been. But he was gone. The only thing left was the whisper in her mind. 3 days, Zanele. Or they'll silence you too. If you're still watching, comment 3 days below. The village square emptied slowly, but the weight of their judgment lingered in the air. Whispers followed Zanele as she walked through the dirt paths, eyes boring into her back. No one spoke to her. No one dared. Her mother did not wait for her at their hut. The door was shut, the meaning clear, she was alone in this. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a cold wind swept through the village. The night was unusually still, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Zanele sat on the floor of her hut, her heart pounding. 3 days, Zanele. Or they'll silence you too. Chief Tobo's words played over and over in her mind. The voices had gone quiet since the village square. But that silence felt worse. It felt like something was waiting. Watching. She needed to think. If the chief had been hiding something, where would she start? Then she remembered the graveyard. It was foolish, maybe even dangerous. But the whispers had started at his funeral. If there were more buried secrets, that was the place to find them. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed a small lantern and stepped outside. The night was darker than usual, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The path to the graveyard stretched ahead of her, lined with swaying trees that whispered as the wind passed through them. Each step felt heavier than the last. Then, she heard it. A rustling. A faint breath. Someone was following her. Zanele stopped, her paws hammering. The night was silent again. Too silent. She turned slowly, holding up the lantern. The dim glow barely cut through the darkness. Nothing. But then, a shadow moved. Zanele's breath caught. A figure stood just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. Tall. Motionless. Watching. Who's there? She whispered. No answer. The figure took a step closer. Zanele's fingers tightened around the lantern handle. She should run. She should turn back. But then, she heard the voice. You're getting too close. A gust of wind blew out the lantern's flame. Darkness swallowed everything. And then, something grabbed her wrist. What do you think grabbed Zanele? Comment below. Zanele's scream caught in her throat as icy fingers wrapped around her wrist. The touch was wrong, not like a person's. It felt weightless, yet impossibly strong, as if the very air had gripped her. She yanked back, stumbling away. The lantern clattered to the ground. The darkness swallowed everything. Her breathing came fast and sharp. She couldn't see. Couldn't move. Then, a whisper. Leave it alone, Zanele. The voice was close. Too close. She spun around, heart hammering. Shadows shifted around her, blending into the night, forming shapes that weren't there before. A single breath whispered past her ear. Turn back, before you end up like us. Zanele's pulse roared in her ears. The graveyard. The chief. The voices. The warnings. It wasn't just about Chief Tobo anymore. There were more secrets buried here. Gritting her teeth, she forced her fear down. No, her voice came out stronger than she felt. I'm not stopping. Silence. Then, the grip on her wrist loosened. The air around her shifted. The shadows withdrew, melting into the trees as if they had never been there. Zanele stumbled back, gasping for air. She fumbled with the lantern, relighting it with shaking hands. The flame flickered to life, casting a dim glow around her. She was alone again. But not for long. She turned toward the graveyard, forcing her feet forward. The fear still coiled in her stomach, but she couldn't stop now. Something was waiting for her among the graves. And she was going to find it. If you're still watching, comment "I wouldn't go." What do you think Zanele will find in the graveyard? Comment below. Zanele stepped into the graveyard, the lantern's flickering light barely pushing back the shadows. The air was thick, heavy, as if the dead were still breathing beneath the soil. Graves stretched before her in uneven rows, some marked with stones, others just mounds of earth. The scent of damp soil filled her nose as the wind carried whispers through the trees. She swallowed hard. Where should she start? Then, she felt it. A pull. Something, somewhere, was calling to her. She followed the feeling, her feet moving before her mind could question why. The graveyard was silent except for the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Then she saw it. A grave at the far end of the burial ground. New. Unmarked. Zanele's heart skipped. She hadn't seen it before, not at Chief Tobo's funeral. The soil was fresh, uneven, as if someone had buried something in a hurry. A sharp wind sliced through the graveyard, and then... "Don't!" The voice was right behind her. Zanele spun, lantern raised. Nothing. Just graves. Just shadows. But she wasn't imagining things. Someone, or something, didn't want her here. Her breathing quickened. The pull to the grave grew stronger, a silent force pushing her closer. Slowly, she knelt beside it and pressed her palm to the damp soil. The ground was colder than the rest. Wrong. A shudder rolled through her. What is buried here? Then, the whisper returned. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was a name. Lindani. Zanele's stomach clenched. Lindani. Chief Tobo's missing servant. The one who had vanished months before the chief's death. Her breath caught. She had found him. But before she could move, before she could even think, a hand shot out from the soil. What do you think Lindani will reveal? Comment below. Zanele screamed and scrambled back, her lantern swinging wildly. The hand, thin, covered in dirt and decay, twitched as it pushed through the damp soil. Then, another hand appeared. Fingers clawed at the earth, dragging up an arm, a shoulder, a body. Zanele's breath itched as a face emerged. Hollow eyes. A mouth full of dirt. Lindani. The servant who had disappeared. A deep, rattling breath escaped his cracked lips as he turned his head toward her. His eyes weren't empty. They were looking at her. You found me, Zanele. Her body locked up. He was talking. But his lips barely moved. No. He wasn't speaking aloud, he was speaking in her head. They killed me. Zanele's pulse roared in her ears. Who? His body shuddered as more of him emerged from the grave. His movements were slow, unnatural, as if something was still holding him down. The chief. And the elders. The lantern flickered violently. Zanele's skin went cold. The elders. Elder Nkosi. Elder Bika. Elder Sizwe. The men who had banished her. The man who had sworn Chief Tobo was a good man. Her breath came in gasps. Why? Why did they kill you? Lindoni's jaw clenched. His fingers clawed at the dirt, his body straining against some unseen force. Something didn't want him to speak. I knew. Zanele's hands shook. Knew what? Lindoni's head snapped up, eyes locking onto hers. The chief's biggest secret. Wind howled through the graveyard. The trees groaned, their branches twisting. Shadows shifted. Then, a sharp crack. Lindani's body convulsed. His mouth opened wide in a silent scream. Zanele gasped. Lindani. What's happening? His fingers twitched. His jaw trembled. His eyes were full of fear. Then, he was yanked back into the grave. So fast, Zanele barely had time to react. 1 second, he was there, reaching for her. The next, the earth swallowed him whole. The ground smoothed over as if nothing had ever been there. Zanele's breath hitched. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. The graveyard was silent again. Too silent. Then, in the wind, a whisper. They are watching you now, Zanele. She grabbed her lantern and ran. Text on screen, what do you think the chief's secret is? Comment below. Zanele ran, the graveyard disappearing behind her, but she could still feel it, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against her back. The village huts came into view, their thatched roofs barely visible in the dim moonlight. She forced herself to slow down, gasping for breath. She couldn't let anyone see her like this. If they knew she had gone to the graveyard. He shuddered. They were already looking for a reason to get rid of her. She slipped between the huts, her pulse still hammering. Every shadow felt like it was stretching toward her. They are watching you now, Zanele. Who were they? She reached her hut and ducked inside, shutting the door behind her. She pressed her back against the wood, heart racing. The silence felt unnatural, as if the air itself was waiting. Then, a sound. A soft rustling outside. Zanele's breath caught. Her hut had no windows, just a woven curtain over the entrance. The wind shouldn't sound like footsteps. She took a slow step forward. Then, a shadow passed over the doorway. She froze. Someone was outside her hut. Zanele's fingers trembled as she reached for the lantern, barely daring to breathe. Then, a voice. Low. Dangerous. You should have stayed quiet, girl. A hand ripped aside the curtain. Zanele screamed. A figure loomed in the entrance. Elder Nkosi. His face was shadowed, but she could see the glint of his eyes. Cold. Unforgiving. Her stomach twisted. He knew. Her voice came out in a whisper. What do you want? Nkosi stepped inside, slow, deliberate. The hut suddenly felt too small. Too trapped. You were at the graveyard. His voice was as sharp as a blade. Zanele clenched her fist. I. His head tilted slightly. Did you see something? The question sent ice down her spine. He was testing her. If she told him what she saw, if she admitted Lindani had spoken to her, would she survive the night? Her mind screamed at her to lie. But then she remembered, Lindani had been killed for knowing too much. She swallowed. No. Nkosi studied her. The silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, he nodded. Good. His voice was calm, but there was something behind it. Something dark. He turned to leave but paused at the doorway. 3 days, Zanele. Then, just before stepping out into the night, he added, don't go back there. The curtain fell back into place. Zanele's knees nearly buckled. She grabbed the lantern, her hands shaking. Nkosi wasn't just warning her. He was threatening her. But he had just made one mistake. By telling her not to go back, he had confirmed there was more to find. And now, Zanele knew she had to return. Should Zanele go back to the graveyard? Comment below. Zanele didn't sleep. Couldn't. Even after Elder Nkosi had left, the air in her hut still felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. She sat by the dim lantern, her mind racing. Nkosi knew. The elders were hiding something. And whatever it was, they were willing to kill to keep it buried. But Lindani had already spoken. The chief's biggest secret. Her pulse quickened. What had Lindani discovered before he was murdered? What had Chief Tobo been hiding? Outside, the village was quiet. But Zanele knew better. They were watching her. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to steady her breathing. Maybe she should wait. Maybe she should let it go. Then, the lantern flickered. Zanele frowned. A chill brushed over her skin, though the air was still. Then, a whisper. You must run, Zanele. Her stomach twisted. It wasn't the wind. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the shadows of her hut, a figure stood, barely visible in the dim light. Zanele's body went rigid. She knew that shape. Lindani. His mouth didn't move, but his voice echoed inside her head. They will not let you leave. Zanele forced herself to speak. What do they want? The shadows around him shifted. His eyes flickered, something desperate in them. They think you know too much. A sharp knock sounded at the door. Zanele jumped. She turned, heart pounding. No one knocked at this hour. She spun back to Lindani. But he was gone. The hut was silent. Empty. They knocked him again. Harder this time. Her pulse hammered. She couldn't ignore it. Slowly, she stood, stepping toward the entrance. The curtain trembled as the wind howled outside. With shaking hands, she pulled it aside. A tall figure stood in the dark. Not Elder Nkosi. Not any elder at all. It was a boy. Barely older than her. His clothes were dusty, his face pale. His eyes darted left and right as if he had been running. Zanele, he whispered urgently. We need to talk. Now. If you're still watching, comment who is he, below. Do you think this boy is a friend or an enemy? Comment below. Zanele hesitated at the entrance of her hut, her breath caught between fear and curiosity. The boy's eyes darted around, scanning the darkness as if he expected someone to be watching. Who are you? She whispered. I'm Themba, he said quickly. I know what you've been doing. You went to the graveyard. Her stomach tightened. How do you know that? Themba stepped closer. Because I've been watching you, just like they have. Zanele's grip on the curtain tightened. They. Themba swallowed hard. The elders. He glanced over his shoulder before lowering his voice. You need to leave, Zanele. Now. They are planning to get rid of you before you talk. Her heart pounded. Why do you care? His jaw clenched. Because Lindani was my brother. Zanele's breath hitched. Lindani. The man who had spoken to her from the grave. Themba's fist caught. I know they killed him. I know the chief wasn't the saint they made him out to be. And now, they think you know too much. Zanele's pulse roared in her ears. He was right. She had already been warned. The elders wouldn't let her live long enough to expose their secret. What did Lindani find out? She asked. Themba's expression darkened. The chief, he had enemies. But not the kind you'd expect. He made promises to things that shouldn't be bargained with. And when he failed to deliver, he paid the price. Zanele's throat tightened. Are you saying? Yes. Themba's eyes burned with urgency. The chief didn't just die. Something came for him. And now that you've started digging, it's coming for you too. A gust of wind howled past the hut, rattling the walls. Zanele took a shaky breath. If that's true, why haven't they killed me yet? Themba looked her straight in the eyes. Because they need to know how much you've heard first. Her stomach twisted. Then, a distant shout. Both of them tensed. Footsteps. Fast. Approaching. Temba grabbed her wrist. It's now or never. If you stay, you die. Zanele's mind raced. She could run. Disappear. Let this secret die with her. Or, she could end it. A slow fire ignited in her chest. No, she said. Temba blinked. No. She squared her shoulders. I'm not running. If they think I know too much, then I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. Temba stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Then we'd better move fast. The voices outside grew louder. Zanele took one last look at her hut. Then she turned and ran into the night. If you're still watching, comment Zanele is brave below. What do you think will happen when Zanele exposes the truth? Comment below. Zanele and Temba ran through the darkened village, their footsteps barely making a sound on the dusty ground. Behind them, the elders' voices rose, searching, hunting. She knew there was no turning back. It was either to expose the truth or be buried alongside Lindani. Temba led her to an abandoned hut near the village square, one that had been empty since its owner mysteriously vanished years ago. Another secret buried by the elders. Zanele clenched her fist. Not this time. We have to tell everyone, she whispered. Before they find us. Temba hesitated. They'll never believe us. They don't have to, she said. I'll make them hear it for themselves. Temba frowned. What do you mean? Zanele swallowed. She had one last chance to use her gift. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and focused. Listen. The air shifted. The walls groaned. Then, the whispers returned. He made the deal with blood. Zanele's skin prickled. He offered us souls in exchange for power. Temba's breath hitched. Who is speaking? Zanele's voice came out hollow. The chief. A cold wind swept through the hut, and suddenly, they weren't alone. A shadow loomed in the corner, a shape pulling itself from the darkness. It wasn't fully human anymore. A twisted form, trapped between worlds. Chief Tobo. His hollow eyes locked onto them, and his mouth opened in a soundless scream. Zanele and Temba bolted. Zanele ran straight to the center of the village, where the people were already gathering. The elders had woken them, claiming she was a threat to the community. Perfect. She skidded to a stop and turned to face them. I know what you did, she shouted. The villagers fell silent. The elders stepped forward, faces twisted in anger. What nonsense are you speaking, girl? Elder Nkosi barked. You murdered Lindani to protect Chief Tobo's secret, she said. You thought you buried the truth with him, but the dead don't stay silent. A murmur spread through the crowd. Doubt. Fear. Suspicion. Nkosi sneered. You expect us to believe the ramblings of a mad girl. Zanele smiled coldly. I don't need you to believe me. She turned to the villagers. I need you to listen. She closed her eyes, breathing deep. Then, she called the voices. A hush fell over the village as the wind howled unnaturally. Then the whispers began. The chief made a deal with the Dark Ones. He took lives to protect his power. And when Lindani found out, they killed him. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then, a new voice joined the whispers. I was innocent. The villagers froze. They knew that voice. Lindani. The ground trembled. A wailing sound echoed through the night. Then, a figure stepped forward from the shadows. The elders staggered back. Lindani's form, ghostly and hollow-eyed, stood before them. You murdered me, he said, his voice raw with sorrow and rage. The villagers cried out in horror. The elders turned to run. But the ground beneath them split open. Darkness swallowed them whole. Their screams echoed for only a second, then silence. Just like that, they were gone. The village was never the same after that night. The people no longer whispered about Zanele in fear. They spoke her name with respect. She had uncovered the truth. And the spirits had delivered justice. As for Zanele, she knew her work wasn't done. There were still secrets buried in the earth. Still voices waiting to be heard. And now, she was ready to listen. If you made it this far, comment, justice has been served.